Hello students, welcome to the third video of the third module in this course on creative writing. This video is titled Exploring Ideas Through Poetry. In this video we shall learn how ideas and how various themes are explored and handled in poetry, and also how meaning is made in poetry. Now let's try and understand what is the context of poetry. The context of poetry is the entire range of human interests. According to Wordsworth, poems can be about anything as long as they concern us as enjoying and suffering beings. Now, when Wordsworth uses the words to enjoy and to suffer, he basically is talking about emotions. But even though Wordsworth apparently emphasizes the emotional in this statement, just like he does in the definitions of poetry that we have discussed in other videos already, much great and significant poetry is more contemplative than emotional. In fact, many of Wordsworth's own poems also are. Emotion and reason, thought and feeling are all associated with men in society. And poetry is about human nature in its social relations. The purely private may not figure in poetry because the use of language itself is the process of socialization. After all, the medium of language plays a vital part here, and we have to own that much poetry is like local wine and tends to lose its unique source, the aroma of vineyard and weather, harvest and history when sipped abroad. So in this video, we shall discuss some of the most frequently explored themes in poetry. We shall focus on 5 themes in particular. The first is religion. The reason why I wanted to begin with religion is because, as we had mentioned in the previous video, some of the earliest verses composed by humans were prayers, they were hymns, or they were chants. A rich body of poetry in many ancient traditions is preserved in what is revered as scripture or as devotional text. We have examples such as the Bhagavad Gita, the Zend Avesta, the Dhammapada, the Namgukha, for example, and all these are composed in verse. This choice of the verse form was, of course, mainly due to the oral nature of the origin of most of these texts, which are also meant to be ritually recited. But it is also inspired by faith in the aesthetic and incantational powers inherent in language. Later poets have also used poetry to verbalize their spiritual probes and experiences. The Anglican cleric and poet G.M. Hopkins, for example, wrote passionate poems that are grounded in his deep Christian appreciation of nature and life. Look at the following poem as an example, where he celebrates the beauty in the details of the landscape around him as evidence of a divine mighty presence that brought them into being. This example, you might note, is also an example of the curtal sonnet, a contracted form of the sonnet which consists of 11 lines. This form was in fact invented by Hopkins himself. This poem is called Pied Beauty. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as the brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-coal chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plough, and all traits, their gear and tackle and trim, all things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle, dim, he fathers forth, whose beauty is past change, praise him. The Bhakti saint poets of the 15th to 17th century India wrote verses and songs to share their devotional principles and mystical experiences. We'll look at one example from Kabir. We'll look at a few lines. O companion, that abode is unmatched, where my complete beloved is. In that place there is no happiness or unhappiness, no truth or untruth, neither sin nor virtue. There is no day or night, no moon or sun. There is radiance without light. There is no knowledge or meditation, no repetition of mantra or austerities, neither speech coming from Vedas or books, doing, not doing, holding, leaving, all these are all lost too in this place. No home, no homeless, neither outside or inside. Micro and macrocosm are non-existent. 5 elemental constituents and the Trinity are both not there. Witnessing unstruck Shabbat sound is also not there. No root or flower, neither branch or seed. Without a tree, fruits are adorning. Primordial Om sound, breath synchronized Soham, this and that, all are absent. The breath too unknown. Where the beloved is there is utterly nothing. Says Kabir, I have come to realize. Whoever sees my indicative sign will accomplish the goal of liberation. The Gitanjali by Rabindranath Tagore, for which you might know he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, is a collection of devotional lyrics inspired by bhakti poetry. We shall look at one example to try and understand the devotional theme contained in his poems. Thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. This frail vessel thou emptiest again and fillest it ever with fresh life. This little flute of a reed thou hast carried over hills and dales and hast breathed through it melodies eternally new. At the immortal touch of thy hands, my little heart loses its limits in joy and gives birth to utterance ineffable. Thy infinite gifts come to me only on these very small hands of mine. Ages pass, and still thou pourest, and still there is room to fill. But then it is not just mystical poets, but then modern poets as well, who come from more comparatively secular backgrounds, who have written poems with deep spiritual and mystical insight. Rainer Maria Rilke, for example, is known for the intense mysticism in his poetry. We shall look at a few translated lines from the Duno Elegies as an example. Who, if I cried out, would hear me among the angelic orders? And even if one were to suddenly take me to its heart, I would vanish into its stronger existence. For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror, that we are still able to bear. And we revere it so because it calmly disdains to destroy us. Every angel is terror. So that was the first theme. The next theme is that of time and mortality. This theme is important because poets and artists have always pondered over questions of time, mortality, and the very nature of human existence. These questions have inspired both philosophical works and creative works. The Assamese poet Hiren Bhattacharya, for example, called death as yet another art. Let's look at one poem by Emily Dickinson, where she has personified death as a benevolent host who transports the speaker into the realm of eternity. Let us also consider one more poem. This poem is called Marina. This is a dramatic monologue by T.S. Eliot, which explores themes such as time, memory, the transience of life, and also rebirth. We shall look at a few lines from this poem. What seas, what shores, what grey rocks and what islands, what water lapping the bow, and scent of pine and the wood thrush singing through the fog. What images return, O my daughter? Those who sharpen the tooth of the dog, meaning death. Those who glitter with the glory of the hummingbird, meaning death. Those who sit in the sty of contentment, meaning death. Those who suffer the ecstasy of the animals, meaning death. We already discussed when we were going through the different types of poetry, the poetic form called elegy, which is a type of poem which is inspired by the grief of death and loss. So we shall look at one example of the elegy. This is by Walt Whitman. This poem was written on the occasion of the death of the American President Abraham Lincoln. Sometimes poets have also contemplated the possibility of humans surpassing death and achieving immortality. Yeats, for example, considered it possible to transcend mortality through the cultivation of art and intellect, which is expressed in his poem called Sailing to Byzantium. Next, let's look at how Shakespeare claims to be able to immortalize his beloved in art, who otherwise remains vulnerable to the ravages of time. I shall read out a few lines from this poem. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his cold complexion dimmed. Every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Yet other poets have adopted a philosophical approach to death and accepted mortality as an unavoidable culmination or perhaps just another moment of transition in the act of existence. I want to use one example from the poet Khalil Gibran, who calls death an essential part of existence itself in the following lines. The next theme that we need to discuss is nature. Nature is, of course, a very important theme which is found in poetry across the world and in all ages. It is, in fact, believed that the very first verse or shloka of ancient Indian poetry was born when Vedvyas witnessed the grief experienced by a bird which had lost its mate. So basically, nature has been a great source of inspiration for artists across time and cultures. But then ways of imagining and envisioning the natural world has been as multifarious and complex as the understanding of the word nature itself has been. Because although it seems very simple, when you actually start thinking, actually trying to understand what this term nature means, you realize that it is quite vague, that it is quite ambiguous, and it is quite slippery. Concepts of nature vary. They are determined by history, by ideology, by cultural, economic, or ecological influences as well. But then despite this diversity in conception and approach, nature has always provided the perfect setting, subject, and imagery for poetic explorations of the significance of human life, its joys, sorrows, and aspirations as well. In poems and mythological characters or episodes, elements of nature often appear in godly or human-like form. The classic Sanskrit poem Meghduta by Kalidas describes an exiled lover dispatch a message to his beloved wife through an autumn cloud. Often nature or elements of it are personified in poetry to articulate the states of the human mind. For example, Keats imagines the autumn season as a harvester at various stages of harvesting activities in his poem Ode to Autumn. Nature imagery is used by poets to provide a reference for human emotions and experiences. Let us look at this example called Thoughts in the Silent Night by the Chinese poet Li Bai, who lived in the 8th century. In this poem, the sight of the moon fills the speaker with a sense of homesickness. Moonlight reflects off the front of my bed. Could it actually be the frost on the ground? I look up to view the bright moon and look down to reminisce about my hometown. Nature was the biggest source of inspiration for William Wordsworth's poetry. In fact, any discussion of the theme of nature cannot be complete without a reference to William Wordsworth. He considered nature as a divine force, a mentor, and a healer. He found joy in nature, and he presented himself as a devout worshipper of nature, because of which he has been described by later poets as the high priest of nature. Wordsworth's philosophy of nature is perhaps best captured in the poem Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, where he reflects upon the evolving impact of the landscape surrounding the River Wye upon his psyche over time. Let us read a few lines from the poem to try and understand this philosophy of nature that Wordsworth believed in. 5 years have passed, 5 summers, with the length of 5 long winters, and again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day is come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tubs, which at the season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows. Hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild. These pastoral farms, green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees, with some uncertain notice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. Other poets such as Ted Hughes and K.K. Darwala, who is an Indian English poet, portray the raw primal power in nature. They do not try to romanticize, anthropomorphize, or reduce nature to a mere backdrop for the theatre of human actions. An example is the poem Wolf by K.K. Darwala that you can see on the screen. Other poets have also treated the theme of nature a little differently. For example, indigenous poets like Mamang Dai from Arunachal Pradesh bring out the interdependence between nature and humans. Particularly, she talks about the symbiotic relationship shared by the indigenous people of Northeast India with their natural environment. In the poem Man and Brother, for example, she makes a reference to the mythical belief among the Adi tribe, to which Dai belongs, that man and tiger are born of the same mother and are hence brothers. Again, in the poem Birthplace, she brings in eco-mystical references to origin narratives found among the Adi people, in which man is believed to be the literal child of nature. After this we shall move on to the next important theme that is frequently found in poetry, which is that of war and political injustice. Political realities have been an important subject and also an inspiration for poets across the world through generations. The narrative in heroic poems that we already discussed was often built around a great war. Examples like the Iliad, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and Shahnama show that the action in all these epics is structured by a war or a battle of immense scale and significance. In fact, poetry from all over the ancient and medieval world has romanticized warfare and celebrated gallantry, military glory, and leadership. For example, Emerson's poem Concord Hymn, written in memory of the battles of Lexington and Concord that led to the beginning of the American Revolutionary War, celebrates patriotism and martyrdom. However, beginning with the 20th century, particularly with the experiences of the First World War, poets stopped eulogizing warfare and military conflict. Soldier poets, who had directly participated in the Great War, started presenting vivid pictures of the traumatic and horrific realities of modern-day warfare. In the poem, Dulce et decorum est by Wilfred Owen, for example, he exposes the hollowness in the Latin phrase that he has used for the title of the poem. This phrase is taken from the Roman poet Horace, which literally means that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. But what Owen does is he provides stark images of the horrors endured by soldiers on the battlefield and calls this phrase to be an old lie. These writings of the war poets of the World War transformed the sensibility and very idiom of European poetry and inaugurated the modernist era in European writings. Easter 1916, which was written to commemorate the 1916 Rising against the British occupation of Ireland, is one of Yeats's finest public poems. It is a complex poem which more than illustrates Yeats's achievement of objectivity by means of using a dramatic mask. It uses the terms of drama in order to stylize and objectify the world of political fact, which is its subject. In the writing of this poem, literacy problems have become for Yeats analogues for the problems of living. Here life and art interact and merge into a single image. So poets since the modern era have actively engaged with the subject of conflict and political violence, while also continuously interrogating the function and power of poetry itself in the face of conflict and injustice. The destruction and horrors of the World War had led Auden to pronounce that poetry makes nothing happen. The brutality and genocides of the Second World War made poets of post-war Europe believe that writing poetry anymore is impossible. And yet, poets who had experienced the violence of the war firsthand used poetry as a powerful means of providing witness. Thinking bone by bone, feeling with his forehead laboriously, he resurrects what it was to be human. The Russian poet Osip Mandelstam, who I just quoted, was a victim of Stalin's torture. Yet he did not stop celebrating life and tried to resurrect what it was to be human. Vasco Popa of Yugoslavia, Zbigniew Herbert of Poland, like many others, were caught in mid-adolescence by the war. The attempts these poets have made to express man's awareness of what he is being put to by man and human institutions and their endeavor to transcend suffering have brought about a completely new kind of poetry. Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet, when he lay in a doorway, had watched the bullets lifting the cobbles out of the street beside him. This is when he realized that most poetry was not equipped for life in a world when people do actually die. All these poets have put their poetry to this severe test, and the result is a poem of immediacy with an awareness of the past. Look at the following poem by Vasco Popa as an example. Besides providing a release to the trauma and pessimism faced by artists during and in the immediate aftermath of the wars in the transatlantic nations, poetry has also proved to be a powerful medium for speaking about the political struggles of peoples and groups across the world. For example, African American poets have registered protest against the injustices faced by their community through poetry. Maya Angelou was an African American writer and activist who was an advocate of Black American culture and rights. Just look at the following lines by Angelou, where she presents a poignant picture of the violence and oppression faced by Black Americans, along with their indomitable resolve to survive, of course. Like Maya Angelou, Mahmoud Darwish is another resistance poet who used poetry as a tool for speaking about the struggles of the Palestinian people. Look at this poem called To Our Land by Darwish as an example. Now we shall move on to the next theme in poetry, which is love. Yes, strife and hardship that we just discussed have undoubtedly ignited the poet's soul throughout history. But simultaneously, love has also continued to motivate the poet to pick up the pen in all ages. The ancient Greek poet Sappho has left behind a number of passionate love lyrics that celebrate the overwhelming power of love. This following fragment is an example. The sonnet form that we earlier discussed was most commonly employed for love lyrics. Edmund Spenser's Amoretti is a sonnet sequence that describes the speaker's romantic relationship and its eventual culmination in marriage. Let's look at one sonnet from this sequence as an example. Any discussion of love poetry cannot be complete without talking about Neruda, because Pablo Neruda is celebrated as one of the greatest writers of love poems in the 20th century. His love poems are marked by a spontaneity and an intense passion and eroticism. This is one very famous love poem by Pablo Neruda called Love Sonnet 11. Yes, so far we discussed the various types of themes that poetry can be written about, that poetry can be inspired by. But then, since we are also talking about how meaning is made in poetry, we should remember that no poet can have his meaning alone all by himself. What the poet does is he purifies the dialect of the tribe and he leaves it richer and more capable of wielding the burden of changing and even challenging realities. This enriched language looks at reality of man and his institutions, but it is only an answering look, and it is quite different from the look of discursive prose. We can actually imagine a poem to exist in a triangle, the points of which are first the poet, second his audience, and third that area of experience which we call variously as reality or truth or nature. And between these points run lines of tension, and depending on the time, the place, the poet and the audience, these lines will lengthen or shorten. At one time, we may find the poet and the audience close together and so-called reality a great distance from them. The elongation of this triangle stifles the poem, and to a late age, it will seem merely the product of an agreement between the poet and the audience to deceive themselves. Again, at another time, we will find the poet close to the point called reality, but the audience a great distance from them both. A later age is likely to declare of this poet that he was ahead of his time, but the distance of his audience will have caused some staining of the voice, just like what happened in the case of Blake, who was discovered much later after his time. There are infinite variations, but the finest poems in any language are likely to be those which exist in an equilateral triangle, each point pulling equally in a moment of perfect tension. Hopkins was arguably ahead of his time, while Tennyson was close to his time, an audience that seems part of the environment. But then, the poet's first duty is to tell his truth. As William Butler Yeats says, the poet must picture saint or hero or hillside as he sees them, not as he is expected to see them. So this is the end of the video, and I hope we had an useful discussion of the various themes of poetry and how meaning and context is important in any discussion or any composition of poetry. Thank you.